In this video, I'll show you my favorite method for sharpening a photo. To begin, let's apply the high pass filter. When you add this filter, it will cover your entire photo with 50% gray. We'll be using the overlay blend mode on this, and as we learned earlier in the course, overlay has no effect on anything that's 50% gray. So if we used overlay right now, this filter wouldn't do anything. But as I bring the radius up, you can see that it will change from this 50% gray. Now the filter has become dark in dark areas of the photo and lighter in light areas of the photo. To make this even easier to see, I'm going to turn on monochrome, which will remove any colors that are bleeding through. So now you can really see that all this is varying shades of gray. And just to make this even clearer, you can see that the dark and light areas on this filter match up perfectly to our photo. Okay, so if I use the overlay blend mode right now, what will happen to this gray layer? If you remember back to the overlay lesson from earlier in the course, I think you already know the answer to this, but let's take a look. Now that this is set to overlay, the dark areas in the filter have made those parts of the photo darker, while the light areas of the filter have made the photo lighter. Here's the before and after of that. Before, after. And really that's all sharpening is. It just makes dark areas darker and bright areas brighter. But sharpening is special because it doesn't darken all dark areas, and it doesn't brighten all bright areas. Instead, it looks for edges. Edges are parts of the photo that transition from dark to light or light to dark. For example, think of someone with a dark shirt in front of a light background. The area that transitions between the dark shirt and the light background is an edge that the sharpening will add contrast to. So the shirt would become darker and the background would become brighter. But when sharpening, you usually want to sharpen something with small edges. For example, a common thing to sharpen would be dark eyelashes. On the edge of an eyelash, there's a transition between light and dark. So when sharpening, that's an edge that would have some extra contrast added to it. And the best part of sharpening is that you get to decide how big the edges should be. Using a large radius, we'll look for large areas of light and dark, like different colored stripes in the tiger's fur. But using a small radius will add contrast to small edges in a photo, like tiny eyelashes or individual pieces of fur. Usually, it's best to use a small radius, like something around 1 to 3 pixels. Okay, now let's come back into Affinity to see how this works in practice. First, I'm going to turn the blend mode back to normal. Then I'm going to make the radius smaller. Now we can only see the faint edges of the tiger's fur. Most of the filter is still 50% gray, so what you can see really is just the smallest of differences between dark areas and lighter areas. So as an example, let's look at this area right here. We have a light fur and then a dark spot right next to it. And you can see if I turn the filter off that this perfectly corresponds with the photo's light and dark areas. Now, if we turn on overlay, you'll be able to see that that area becomes lighter and darker along the edge. So here's the before and after. adding more sharpness and contrast to that small area. And now we can go ahead and zoom out and see the before and after. It can be hard to see zoomed out like this, so if you do want a stronger effect, you can go ahead and duplicate the high pass filter a few times until you get the look that you want. I'll just hold Shift to select all of these layers so we can see a complete before and after. You might be wondering why you would duplicate the filter instead of just using a larger radius. And that's a really good question. When we duplicate the small radius filter, the small areas get sharper. This tends to make the details of the photo look really nice. In this case, I duplicated it a little bit too much, just so it's easy to see in the video. But you can see that the individual pieces of fur are nicely defined here. Now, if we raise the radius really high instead, then the large areas would get sharpened something like this. This definitely has added more contrast into our photo, but the fur is not well defined. It looks a little bit strange when you compare it to how nice the photo looked with defined fur. So that's why I suggest you keep the radius nice and low, and then just duplicate it over and over until you have the sharpness that you want. Okay, now let's see another example of sharpening. This time, we'll do it on a portrait photo. To start, we can go ahead and apply the high pass filter. Then, as a first step, I always like to turn on monochrome, just so that the colors don't have weird contrast being added to them. And then we can go ahead and raise the radius. You can see that only the small details in this photo, the small pieces of her hair, and details around her eyes will have contrast added to them. This time, instead of overlay, I'm going to use soft light. I actually prefer the softer appearance of soft light when I'm doing sharpening, so I tend to use soft light instead of overlay, but feel free to try either one. Alright, with that done, I'm just going to duplicate this filter a few times. And now we can go ahead and zoom in and take a look at the difference. I'll hold Shift to select all of these layers, and now we can see the before and after. I think this filter looks really nice to give her eyes more detail, but I don't really like how her skin and hair look. This is a really easy fix, so let's go ahead and do that. First, with all of these still selected, I'm going to click and drag them above our photo layer. Then I'll press Command or Control G to group them. With all of these filters in a group, I'm going to add a mask to the whole group. That way we can paint the filter just over the areas where we want it. Right now the filters are still being applied to our whole photo, so I'm going to invert this with Command or Control I. Now the filters aren't being applied to the photo at all, and we can just grab the paintbrush and paint in white paint to reveal the sharpness just over the areas where we want it. So I'll just grab some white paint, I'll lower my flow so I can softly paint this on, and then we can go ahead and paint this over her eyebrows and her eyes. Although I tend to avoid the whites of her eyes, you can see that's created some strange speckling. So I'm just going to grab some black paint to remove it from those areas. Now, right now, I think the filter is a little bit too strong, but it is helping me to see where I'm painting, so I'll lower it later. So now that it's painted over her eyes and her eyebrows, I think this does give them some nice pop, and you can see the before and after. but I think I'll select the whole group and lower its opacity to make this less intense. Or we could always just delete a few of these high-pass filters. Either way, it's the same thing. Sometimes you want to sharpen a whole photo, like with the tiger photo, and other times you might just want to sharpen a specific part of the photo, like someone's eyes. And now you know how to sharpen a photo. In the next video, we're going to learn about a really fun technique called dodge and burn.